All right, we are very excited to be here today with Dr. Joel Fuhrman, a board-certified family physician with over 25 years practicing nutritional medicine. You may have seen him on television on PBS. You may have read one of his books, or you may know someone who has personally been impacted by his work. Dr. Fuhrman coined the term nutritarian to describe a diet that is nutrient-dense and plant-rich and includes anti-cancer foods, which also facilitate weight loss, improved immunity, and the reversal of diabetes and heart disease. He's the author of 12 books, including 6 New York Times bestsellers, including Eat to Live, the Eat to Live Cookbook, The End of Diabetes, Super Immunity, The End of Dieting, and his newest book, Fast Food Genocide. Dr. Fuhrman is also the director of the Nutritional Research Foundation, a nonprofit organization that promotes research to understand the effect of nutrient-dense diets on chronic disease. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Fuhrman.
My pleasure. Looking forward to talking to you today, and to Robbie and all your listeners.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's start at the top here. Let's start talking about low carbohydrate diets, because as you know, there is a lot of confusion about the benefits and the risks of low carbohydrate diets for people living with type 1 diabetes and people living with type 2 diabetes. So you've talked previously about how low carbohydrate diets actually can shorten your lifespan. Can you go into a little bit of detail about why this actually occurs?
Yes, it's a little bit complicated, but the first thing we have to say is that certainly with type 1 and type 2 diabetes, we want people to eat a diet that is glycemically favorable, and we want so that's important. It's glycemically favorable. But that's not the only criteria we want is glycemically favorable, because that's the only criteria, then we can, we want to also a diet that's lifespan favorable, that's slowing the aging process. That'll protect the brain from aging and becoming demented, and it'll protect from getting cancer. All those things are important, not just glycemically favorable. The question is, can we put together recommendations that utilize every aspect of nutritional excellence that promotes human longevity to maximize our time to fully fuel mental function, to keep our mental faculties in our later years, to not get cancer, and to maximize human longevity. And the advances in nutritional science make this possible today. We can do better than our ancestors did. We can live to be 100 years old with great health and great physical and mental health. So to put that into context now with your question, what's in vogue today is a lot of ketogenic diets, high protein diets, paleo type diets, because people note when they restrict carbohydrates, eat a diet higher in animal products, those foods generally are glycemically favorable because animal products don't raise glucose as much as carbohydrates do. At least as some carbohydrates do, let's say that. The problem is that we have to look at the whole picture, and we have to give certain studies credence that follow thousands of people for decades and look at hard endpoints versus soft endpoints. A soft endpoint might be your triglycerides went down, your glucose got a little better, you lost some weight. Those are soft endpoints. A hard endpoint is you had a heart attack, you stroked out, or you died. The number one hard endpoint, the hardest endpoint would be death. So if we look at studies that we give more credence to, which go on for decades, maybe 10, 20, or 30 years with large numbers of people, we see that as you ratchet up the animal protein, in a direct relationship between more animal protein, we see more heart attack deaths and more cancer deaths. We also see more earlier death in diabetic populations as they eat more animal protein as well. And there's a lot of reasons why. One main reason is that increased animal protein in your diet drives a hormone called IGF-1, and that's insulin-like growth factor 1. And it's called insulin-like because it's a growth hormone like insulin. It promotes fat storage, it promotes body growth, and when we're not growing anymore and we're adults, higher levels of IGF-1 speed up the aging process and speeds up aging of the brain. And it makes the little carbohydrate you eat more fattening if IGF-1 is elevated when insulin goes up. So IGF-1, it revs up insulin to work better. Insulin becomes more angiogenic, and IGF-1 is an angiogenic hormone, but it makes the effects of insulin more angiogenic. The word angiogenesis means the growth of new blood vessels to fuel the growth of body mass, body tissues. So fat cells secrete angiogenic promoters to say to blood vessels, grow into me so I can live and I can grow more. In other words, angiogenesis promotes fat growth and it promotes diabetes. So what I'm saying here is that meat eating more animal protein, promotes angiogenesis and promotes fat storage on the body and makes anything you eat, makes the oil more fattening and makes the carbohydrate more fattening. So it makes the other foods you're eating more fattening, number one, but number two, regardless of its effects on causing the other foods to become more fattening, it still has an effect to age us at a more rapid pace and to shorten our lifespan by increasing all-cause mortality. Now, in the natural world, we have animals that are predators and we have animals that are prey. Predatory animals eat other animals. Now, those animals have a governor control in their lifespan based on how many prey animals they eat. If they overeat the prey animals, nature shortens their lifespan precipitously because they don't want the prey to become extinct. Because if the prey animals become extinct by the overconsumption of them by the predators, then the predators will die out because they won't have any animals to eat. So let's take, for example, the Arctic hare and the lynx. Okay, so the lynx is a cat that eats Arctic hares as their sole source of food. And if they start to eat too many hares, they're like, by the increased animal protein, raising up hormones that speed up the aging process will shorten their lifespan. Now, that will allow the hares to reproduce and come back into life so that they will support the lynx population. But it's not enough because it takes a few generations for the hares to come back. So what happens in nature is that it affects the genes. So it doesn't just shorten lifespan of the lynx, it often shortens lifespan of their children and grandchildren. For 3 generations, we have shortened lifespan because of the excess consumption of animal protein from the lynx. We see the same thing with every animal we study, even if we study carnivores, omnivores, or primarily frugivores. We see the same thing built into all species, that if we can feed an animal and ratchet up their animal protein, in other words, we're talking about biologically complete protein. More biologically complete protein means accelerating the aging process, speeding up the metabolism, the aging process metabolism is the rate at which we're aging. So we age fast, shortens lifespan, and of course, has the effect to increase our susceptibility to the diseases of aging, like blood vessel disease and cancer.
So what you're saying is that the exact same rules apply to human beings as well, except given that human beings, we can domesticate animals, right? We're not susceptible to, the number of animals that are present in nature because we can basically domesticate more. So if we were living in a truly natural world, then we would see the exact same relationship whereby overconsumption of animal-based products would then shorten human lifespan and leave more prey. But that's not happening in our world.
No, but it's worse than that, because animals that are naturally designed to be eating a high plant diet, like primates and like humans, because we can see color, we can taste sweet, we have a primate heritage where our diet is supposed to contain a huge amount of phytochemicals and antioxidants to support a long life. Whereas all animals that eat primarily animal products, mostly predatory animals, have short lifespan because they age much quicker. So what I'm saying is that animal protein ages humans faster and is more dangerous for a human than it would be for a true omnivore or a true carnivore. Even though their lifespans will be naturally shortened, they're designed to eat that food so they can have a better chance of meeting their normally predicted lifespan than a human. Now, we have the ability to live to 100 years old. There's no reason why, with the knowledge we have today, with the knowledge on blue zones, with the knowledge on advanced nutritional science, we can't all live in good health. Most of us live in good health to 100 years old. And certainly that's impossible to do on a diet rich in animal products. If your goal is to be 75 or 80, then probably you can do that on a healthy diet with animal products. But if you're going to want to push to 100 years old, your chance of living to 100 years old on a diet high in animal products is incredibly small because of a lot of factors going on. Also, the bacteria that grow in the gut when you eat more animal products, you grow inflammatory type bacteria that promote TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, that is a natural inflammatory that accelerates atherosclerosis. When you live on foods that promote healthy bacteria growth, and I consider these 4 foods that promote the healthy bacteria growth, because when you eat more raw greens and raw onion and scallion, and we eat more cooked beans and cooked mushrooms. So we're talking here 2 raw foods, 2 cooked foods. The 2 raw foods are, I'll repeat again, are green leafy vegetables and scallion and onion. So there are 2 raw foods. The 2 cooked foods are cooked beans and lentils and mushrooms, cooked. Those foods thicken an adherent biofilm to adhere to the villi, and they slow the glycemic effect of other foods we eat. So when we eat a mango or we eat oatmeal, the glycemic effect of that mango is lessened because we regularly consume these foods that led to a thickening of this adherent biofilm that slows the absorption of glucose through the villi. When we eat a diet that's rich in animal products, the opposite happens, because the type of bacteria, and sweets of course, but the type of bacteria that develop don't inhibit and don't adhere well to the villi, causing the adherent biofilm that takes up permanent residence there. See there. We want these bacteria. It's not just taking probiotics or taking the fermented foods. It's eating the foods that make the biofilm more adherent and taking up a more permanent residence to lower the glycemic effect of your diet in general.
So this is really, really great. I'd like to go into detail on a couple of things you mentioned there. What about a low carbohydrate diet that was vegan or plant-based? Would that be helpful to somebody?
Well, we know that it's important for a diet to maximize human longevity and brain function, right? We want to have a diet high in antioxidants and phytochemicals. Natural primates living in the wild, which we were eventually, designed from, might eat 20 to 50 times as much phytochemicals and antioxidants as humans are eating today. And if we really want to slow the aging process, only one thing has ever been proven to slow aging, extend human lifespan, and that's eating less calories in an environment of nutritional excellence. In other words, we're talking about an environment of nutritional comprehensiveness that's high in antioxidants and phytochemicals. So we're talking about eating a diet rich in nutrients and lower in calories as a means of slowing the metabolic rate, right? So your question now is, what if we ate a diet that was lower in carbohydrates but higher in plant proteins? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, plant-based, but eating lots of greens, lots of vegetables, coconut oil, coconut meat, just a bunch of high-fat plant foods.
Coconut oil and coconut meat are not high protein. That's where you confuse me.
High-fat.
They're high-fat because green vegetables are high in protein, but don't have that much, have about 7% fat in them.
But what he's trying to insinuate is that there are a lot of people in the world of low carbohydrate nutrition. We're sort of trying to ask you questions here that don't come from us. They come from our audience members. They're confused about a whole thousand bunch of topics. And a lot of people are like, oh, okay, well, if plant-based is good and low carbohydrate is maybe good, what if I did plant-based low carb, right? So that's the question, is like, is that a favorable approach for anyone?
Right. You can't do that without eating a lot of oil in your diet, I don't think. But you could explain me if that's possible. And oil is a processed food that doesn't contain phytochemicals or antioxidants. And what I'm saying here is that the more low nutrient food you eat, the shorter your lifespan, and the more calories you eat, the shorter your lifespan. So in order to extend human lifespan and get to be 100 years old with type 1 diabetes, let's say, then you have to eat a diet with lots of foods that are naturally lower in calories, and reduce foods that have a higher caloric density, right? So now, especially if they have a low nutrient density. So oil is your perfect food to be an example of. It's 120 calories a tablespoon, and there's no fiber, and there's no significant load of micronutrients and of vitamins and minerals, and there's no significant load of antioxidants and phytochemicals. So we're taking in calories without any benefit, without any significant benefit. It would be much better if we took those calories and also the more calories we take in, the faster our metabolic rate is. Let me give an example, okay? Let's say I was serving a buffet in my house right behind me, and I had 50 people walk into the buffet on the left side, and when they walked in the room, I gave them an apple to eat. they would take 65 calories less at the buffet because the apple filled them up with nutrients and fiber and fluid, and they'd feel they eat 65 calories less vegetables and less corn and less peas and less beans and less food on the buffet. In the other line, on the right side, I gave another 50 people came in, and I gave them a tablespoon of olive oil or coconut oil and 120 calories a tablespoon. Because there's no fiber and no bulk and no nutrients to curtail their appetite, they would eat 120 calories more than the people eating the apple. Or we could say they wouldn't cut back on the amount of calories they ate the meal. They eat the same amount of calories because oil doesn't shut off the appestat like an apple does. There's no reduction of appestat in oil. Matter of fact, the studies show when you add oil to the food, it actually increases the craving to eat more calories. So people will eat the 120 calories from the oil, and they'll eat an extra 50 calories they wouldn't have eaten if the food was not oiled. So they'll eat more. So now they had 170 calories more than having the person who had the apple. So the oil precipitated overeating. They overate calories. And did they get any significant higher micronutrient density from the oil? No, because if they had some nuts and seeds, let's say they had a half an ounce of nuts and seeds, right? A half an ounce of sunflower seeds or walnuts or sesame seeds, that half an ounce would be, let's say, 75 to 80 calories. Let's say it's 75 calories, okay? They would decrease the meal by 75 calories, but those 75 calories would not all be absorbed in the bloodstream because the fiber and the fiber and sterols and stanols in the nuts and seeds act like fat magnets, and they hold on to fat so tightly that they carry fat out into the toilet bowl. So out of that 75 calories, maybe only 65 or 60, maybe only 60 calories were absorbed out of the 75. We didn't even get all 75. Some of them pulled fat out. The fat was pulled out into the toilet. And it actually extracts fat so tightly that it pulls out oxidized LDL and saturated fat. It pulls out bad fats in the toilet. But now these nuts and seeds with their fats that are adherent to fiber and to sterols are absorbed so slowly into the bloodstream over a period of 3 to 4 hours. So the body can burn it for energy. When you had the coconut oil or the olive oil, there's no fiber to slow the absorption. It's not a whole food, so those oils are absorbed in 5 to 10 minutes. The calories rushing into the bloodstream so rapidly now, it interferes it makes you insulin resistant. It makes the pancreas have to secrete more insulin for the same amount of carbohydrate in the meal. It revs up fat storage hormone. It exacerbates the effect of the negativity of insulin in the sense that it's promoting fat storage more now, and it's promoting angiogenesis. So it makes whatever you're doing worse. So what I'm saying right now is sesame seed oil has a different biological effect compared to sesame seeds. The sesame seeds are considerably lower in calories, but they're absorbed in a different biological way. They take hours to be absorbed. Now, when you get a little bit of fat, a half an ounce of fat in the meal from sesame seeds or walnuts, you might have increased the phytochemical absorption of the meal by 5 to 10-fold. Because now the antioxidants and phytochemicals from the greens and from the onions and from the mushrooms, some of these phytochemicals have a little bit of fat in the meal, increases their absorption by 5 to 10-fold. So we got a tremendous benefit from a little bit of fat from the nuts and seeds, whereas the oil, you got mostly negative effects.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And you mentioned glycemically favorable foods. So can you give us just a little short example of description of what are glycemically favorable foods? Right.
In other words, certain plant foods are not glycemically favorable and certain plant foods are glycemically favorable. And the word glycemic, it means how rapidly the glucose enters the bloodstream. Not how much glucose is in the food, but how rapidly it enters the bloodstream. So for example, I could take a bean that has a serving of beans with 200 calories of carbohydrate in it. But because the beans are mostly full of resistant starch and slowly digestible starches, those 200 carbohydrate calories will feed into the bloodstream over a period of hours. And because you're only getting a few calories coming in every minute, you don't have to produce much insulin to metabolize it. The insulin needs are low. So when you eat green vegetables, even when you eat certain fruits, berries and citrus fruits, and apples because the pectin's involved, and when you eat certain foods, blueberries, for example, but certainly green vegetables, most squashes, beans and peppers and onions and mushrooms and pepper, So when you eat these foods, the amount of glucose entering the bloodstream in that first 30 minutes after consuming the food is relatively a relatively small amount compared to the total amount of calories in that food. Whereas if I eat white potato, white rice, honey, maple syrup, sugar, what are some high glycemic carbohydrates? It's mostly processed foods, right? It's mostly processed carbohydrates because they're ground down into a fine pastry flour-like consistency. Even whole wheat pastry flour, it's whole wheat, but they grind it to such a fine grind that it makes it more glycemically unfavorable. But what we're saying here today is how you can make that food that's moderately glycemically unfavorable, like white rice, and turn it into a food that's very glycemically unfavorable, is add some oil on it or mix it with meat. Because the more you mix it with meat and oil or cheese, the more glycemically unfavorable it's going to become, because then you have these hormones working synergistically in a negative way.
Okay, so this is actually great. So you've touched on a lot here about how low carbohydrate diets can actually shorten your lifespan, about how consuming oils are micronutrient poor, and as a result of that, you can end up consuming larger amounts of calories because they don't stop your appestat.
Correct.
So a lot of this information is very well known. It's very well described. But despite that, low carbohydrate diets are still incredibly popular, and I would argue that they're even gaining popularity by the day. So my question to you is, why is that happening? Is it simply just because telling people to eat foods like butter and cheese and bacon is exactly what they want to hear? And as a result of that, they're more likely to just carry on that behavior? Or is there something a little bit more nuanced that, we're not describing here properly?
Yeah, I think that people like eating those foods. They like the fact that they can eat those foods and still maybe lose a little weight and not get fat because they're carbohydrate restricted. Maybe they're going into ketosis, and ketosis may help them burn fat. So yes, it's a hypothesis that people like to believe in because they get some immediate benefits and they like eating those foods. But we can't base our behavior on a hypothesis when we have studies that long-term show these diets are dangerous and irresponsible. Generally speaking, the diets that have been most popular in the last 50 years are the Atkins-type diets, are diets like, Eat for Your Body type was very big at one time. The more the diet is dangerous, the more it's some type of fad that gives you short-term benefits at the expense of lifespan and long-term dangers, is more likely the public's going to embrace it. The general public doesn't think long-term of what's going to protect the brain from dementia and what's going to make them live to be 100 years old. They just want immediately what they can lose a few pounds and still eat as much food as they want and what they like to eat. So I think you're appealing to people who really are not lifetime students of nutritional science. And it's easy to appeal to them with quick sound bites and fads because you can trick them very easily. If we take the vast amount of nutritional scientists in the world today, 90% of those people who are not commercially affiliated agree that for a diet to be long-term healthy, it has to be rich in unrefined plant matter. It has to contain a wide variety of colorful plant foods, and it has to be low in animal products to be favorable. All the blue zones. Whenever we look at studies on people who've had long lifespans, there are always populations that eat less animal products. And we look at those populations in more detail and we pull out the data. We've noticed that even among populations that live longer, the ones that live longest are those people in those populations that eat less animal products, even among the long-lived populations.
Okay, this is great. So you write a lot about the nutritarian approach. So in your books, you describe that for maximizing metabolic health. Can you give our listeners insight into what the nutritarian lifestyle encompasses and why it's beneficial specifically for people living with type 1 diabetes, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes?
Well, number one, it reverses prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. I'd say it reverses prediabetes in 100% of cases, and it reverses type 2 diabetes in my experience of 25 years with thousands of patients, about 90%. And the reason it doesn't reverse diabetes to normal in 100% is because some people with diabetes for 20 or 30 or 40 years have used medications like these sulfonylureas that overwork the pancreas so hard that the beta cells almost have no function left. They're almost like a type 1.5. They were originally a type 2, but now they're almost a type 1 because there's no beta cell function left. So they might still require a little bit of insulin, and they're not totally reversible. But my experience has been, and the study I published already on this subject, was that that's only 1 in 10 type 2 diabetics. So they even have people in their 80s with type 2 diabetes for 20, 30 years, the majority of them still become non-diabetic. And I'm defining non-diabetic as being normal glucose readings with a hemoglobin A1C below 6 without the need for medication. They still have the same tendency to become diabetic if they eat poorly and become overweight again, but they don't have diabetes if they're eating, if they're living and eating normally, and their blood sugars are normal, and their weight's still staying normal, and their glucose, they don't need medication. Now, for a type 1 diabetic, when I wrote the book, The End of Diabetes, and some type 1 diabetics and their parents have objected to that I didn't say the end of type 2 diabetes specifically, because they're saying that type 1 diabetes has nothing to do with diet. You're not going to end it. You're not going to get rid of it. And this book is not about them. And I'm saying, no, that's not true. First of all, this book has to be read by the type 1 diabetics, because it's the type 1 diabetic that needs it even more. Because now I'm not saying we're going to wipe out type 1 diabetes. The person still is going to have diabetes, but the amount of insulin they're going to require to keep their blood sugars favorable are going to be less than half what they would have by eating more conventionally. And in most cases, my patients and those type 1 diabetics following a nutritarian diet need only 1/3 the amount of insulin they had required in the past. It stabilizes their glucose at low levels. They don't have any highs and lows anymore. And they don't have to keep measuring and shooting themselves so much. They can exercise more without pumping in more. They're much more free to not worry about lows so much, and they're much more free to worry about highs. And they keep their diet, well, we do want them to keep their diet relatively consistent, their exercise habits relatively consistent. But the point I'm making right now is that type 1 diabetes can be a death sentence, where people can become blind, they can have leg amputations, they can go into kidney failure, they can lose brain function early in life, they can have early life heart attacks, and they've generally seen as having a dramatically shorter lifespan with incredibly more morbidity and tragic problems that happen to them at younger ages. And I'm saying that those things don't have to happen, and that a type 1 diabetic can live to be 100 years old without heart attacks, without mental shrinking of the brain, without becoming blind, without getting infected feet. They can be perfectly healthy, because it's the excess insulin that's been thrust on them by the endocrinologists in the diabetic community, because they're taught by this community of type 1 diabetes, just eat whatever you want and take enough insulin to keep your sugars in good control. And if your sugars are good control, you're okay. But that's not okay, because it's the excess insulin that's going to shorten your lifespan, just like the excess insulin shortens the lifespan in the type 2 diabetic, and just like excess insulin shortens lifespan in the non-diabetic. Overweight people who are non-diabetic, they're not diabetic because their beta cells in the pancreas can push out huge amounts of insulin. But just because the beta cells in the pancreas is capable of producing huge amounts of insulin, and they're not diabetic, doesn't mean that insulin is not causing damage. It's not causing cancer. It's not promoting cancer. It's not promoting brain disease, not aging them. It is aging them and causing them to be overweight. But in any case, I'm giving type 1 diabetics the excitement and the confidence that they can live a life without fear and without having a shortened lifespan, to have a happy and healthy and vibrant life. But they can't eat American food. They can't eat pasta and bread and oil and cheeseburgers and pizza and expect that to happen, because they're going to require more insulin, and that extra insulin is going to be damaging them. But the type 1 diabetes is not damaging them. It's the extra insulin. So they have to eat a diet that is low, and that's a lifespan promoting diet, which I call a nutritarian diet, because a nutritarian diet doesn't just look at one aspect of lifespan promotion. It looks at every aspect of lifespan promotion, so the diet maximally extends human lifespan. For example, we know that, and I mentioned this earlier, that the only thing proven to radically extend lifespan of all animals, including primates, and I'm saying proven in a sense that it's been shown in study after study after study, and that's caloric restriction and reduced frequency of food consumption. Caloric restriction and reduced frequency of food consumption in an environment of micronutrient adequacy. We want to get insufficient micronutrients, vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals. but we want to do so in a moderately lower amount of calories. In order to do that, we have to intelligently pick foods that are rich in nutrients. We have to intelligently pick foods that give us the wide breadth of nutrients humans need. And what I've shown in the studies I published with large numbers of people, we're talking about over 700 people, is that nutritional quality of their diet, their appetite naturally goes down. They don't want to eat as much food. They're satisfied with less calories. So eating a lot of high nutrient foods makes you satisfied with a lower amount of calories too. So it all works together so people don't have to struggle. They can eat what they like, but they'll naturally consume less calories because they're eating foods that are richer in nutrients, like G-BOMBs. So I came up with the acronym G-BOMBs. G-B-O-M-B-S stands for greens, beans, onions, mushrooms, berries, and seeds. I want people to remember very easily those foods I want them to eat on a regular basis, on a daily basis, because these foods have documented effects to extend human lifespan and to prevent cancer. And we put to each one of these foods individually has powerful effects to reduce risk of getting cancer. We put a dietary portfolio together to include all the powerful anti-cancer foods. Then we fully maximize the body's abilities to use these phytochemicals and antioxidants to extend human lifespan and not to have happen to us what happens to other Americans. So it's simple. I'm not saying G-BOMBs is everything you need to eat. And I'm not saying it's the only tool you need to know about nutrition, but it's just one helpful tool added onto the other helpful tools. Eat your greens, eat your beans, eat your mushrooms, onions, seeds, and berries.
Perfect. I'm actually really glad to hear you talk about type 1 diabetes in particular, because in the world of type 1 diabetes, a lot of people try and avoid using insulin, or they try and minimize their use of insulin. So let's just say, as a sake of argument, they're using 25 units of insulin per day, and then they will adopt a low carbohydrate diet so that they can push their insulin use all the way down to 5 or 6 or 7 units per day. So Robbie and I have been living, nutrient-dense plant-based diet lifestyle for over 30 years, and we've seen tremendous improvements in our insulin sensitivity in ways that we never would have been able to imagine. And, even though we try and explain that to other people and give them insight into how you can reduce your insulin use as you increase your overall carbohydrate intake and your nutrient density at the same time, still there is this question mark of like, no. Insulin's bad. I don't want insulin. Bad. Insulin's going to make me fat. Therefore, my goal is to drive my insulin use as low as possible. What do you say to somebody who is sort of looking at insulin as being the enemy and trying to drive their insulin as close to zero as possible?
Well, I agree with conceptually with what they're saying, because insulin is the enemy. But just like before in this conversation, I was making IGF-1 the enemy. With too much animal protein drives IGF-1 too high. Likewise, in elderly populations with poor protein bioavailability, some people IGF-1 could be too low. And both two levels that are too high are dangerous, but levels that are too low, IGF-1, are also dangerous. Same thing with insulin. High insulin is abnormal, but eating a diet that drives insulin too low is also dangerous because of other factors that we're talking about that increase aging and promote cancer in the body. So in other words, your diet becomes too acidic, you promote both the bad bacteria, your diet becomes pro-inflammatory, your diet doesn't have enough phytochemicals and antioxidants, and your diet has too many calories. Making your diet so you control your glucose with so many animal products is giving you more calories than you require. So their weight might be favorable, their insulin use might be favorable, but they're doing it with more calories. And the extra calories this diet style is permitting them to consume is revving up the aging process and not supplying you with sufficient phytochemicals and antioxidants to prevent the damage that's going to occur from aging and from increasing metabolism. So there's a lot of factors going on here. We don't want insulin to be that low, but the main reason we don't want it to be that low is because the way they had to get it down that low was through restricting carbohydrate foods that are rich in phytochemicals and antioxidants that extend human lifespan. And the reason they got it down that low is because they're eating mostly animal products and oils and not enough plants that are rich in nutrients. And we need those plants that are rich in nutrients to protect the brain. We need those plants that are rich in nutrients to protect us against cancer. We need those plants that are rich in nutrients to prevent us from strokes, even hemorrhagic strokes that are not caused by atherosclerosis, but also by weakening of the endothelium. And your endothelium weakens, your tissues will weaken, and you'll become an old man at a very young age, even if you're diabetes, even if you're using less insulin. So we can't ignore any one of the parameters and say, I like this idea of keeping my insulin low, but that's the only idea I want to accept. I just want to keep my insulin. I'll just eat meat and oil to keep it down. But you know what? That's not the only criteria that makes for your lifespan. There's other criteria as well you have to consider. And that's phytochemical exposure. That's lower caloric exposure. That's all these other factors. So we want the insulin, yes, moderately low. We want it the same as a level of person who's eating a healthy diet who doesn't have insulin, who doesn't have diabetes, which I have a lot of type 1 diabetics who are using 60 to 80 units of insulin a day. And now a lot of them are using 10 to 15 long-acting, 2 to 3 short-acting. They're taking between 18 and 25 or 18 and 30 units a day, and not 60 and 80 units of insulin a day. But they don't have to, but let's say they're using 10 to 12 long-acting or 10 to 15 long-acting and 3, 3, and 3. So that's 10 plus 15, and using 20, 25 units a day. That's a reasonable amount of insulin because they're going to control it better now because they're going to eat less calories, they're going to keep their body fat low, and they're going to keep their caloric intake relatively low and their phytochemical intake relatively high. All those, you have to see this as a complete package. You can't just take, to part 1 and leave part 2 or part 3 out, or you're not going to have the lifespan benefits.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, let's talk about your newest book, Fast Food Genocide. Can you give our listeners some insight into what they will learn by reading this book?
I really think it's hard for me to say this because, I really love being an author and writing books that have helped people. And in my life, I've never have expected to have been able to reach so many millions of people and have been able to help so many millions through my books that I have with so many best-selling books. So I'm really very grateful for the opportunities I've had. But in doing so, we still have massive tragedy and massive deaths going on. We have areas of this country that are vulnerable. Fast food and processed food has now become the #1 source of calories in America. And we have people live in urban areas where they have 7 times the risk of stroke before age 45. We have people that become diabetic and obese from eating fast food and processed foods have 45 years of potential life loss. 45 years of life loss. People live in urban areas or in relatively food deserts. And I'm talking here about, a lot of people know that these processed foods and these fast foods cause obesity and diabetes and cancer and heart disease, but they don't know they cause mental illness. They don't know 1 in 5 Americans are suffering with mental illness right now. They don't know they decrease your intelligence. They don't know that these foods, how highly addictive they are. They don't know even 1 serving of commercial French fries a week could increase risk of breast cancer and prostate cancer by 25%. They don't know that these foods are addicting and lead people down the road to drug addiction and criminality. And food addiction leads to drug addiction in many cases and increases risk of crime and violence. They don't know that eating these foods destroys the genes. You have epigenetic changes that can be passed on to future generations that are now, we're seeing explosion of autism, learning disabilities, allergies, autoimmune disorders that never, and even childhood cancers that never occurred before in human history. They don't know that we're degenerating sections of our population who are more vulnerable and depriving them of the American dream. And everybody's blamed, and how this confounds and promotes bigotry and racism. Because people are blamed because their skin tone is blamed on maybe not succeeding well or being more prone to poverty, more prone to diabetes, more prone to obesity, and has nothing to do with skin color or skin tone at all. If we take it back and we look at the data based on how much of the processed foods are being eaten and the access to fast food in an area, we can see in the areas of the country where the good foods aren't available, it doesn't matter what the color of the person's skin are. They're going to have the same amount of violence, same amount of diabetes, the same amount of drug use. And the main, how should I say this? The majority of people in federal prison today are there because of nonviolent related drug use offenses, right? Nonviolent drug use offenses. And the link between candy and fake frankenfoods and drug abuse and crime is better than the link between poverty and crime, better than the link between lack of parents and crime, better than the link between poor parenting or bad parenting or social isolation and crime. It's the most powerful link. What I'm saying is that our diet puts tentacles, damaging our society at all levels, and we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. And I'm feeling that if this book was well known by our country, and I'm so excited about this book because I really think that I have the potential to make an inroad to change society and really save so many people's lives that are living in tragedy or are going to have more tragedies occur. And as Americans, and as we're brought up with this idea of equality for all, of equal opportunity for all, right? And the American dream, but it's not that way. We have to have equal food access. We have to have people informed about that. They have to have equal knowledge, like reading, writing, arithmetic, and some nutritional information to let them take care of their family, their children, their loved ones, their communities, to give them this opportunity to improve their economic and their emotional states and not be depressed and confused and be bogged down with addictions by having everything in their, all these incredible stresses put on them by lack of correct food access. So I do feel that this book can change society on multiple levels. It's a call for action. It gives people solutions. It makes food taste great, and it could have a tremendous powerful effect on all of our society.
I actually can't wait to read your book because when I read Eat to Live, I think it was like 2010 maybe, so it was a little bit late. But I had already transitioned my diet from 2003 onwards, so I was in grad school. I was doing all the research. I was living it, and then I read Eat to Live, and I was like, oh my God, you blew my mind yet again. So given that you have an awesome reputation, you're a phenomenal writer, I can't wait to read Fast Food Genocide because that's actually the next book on my list.
Thank you. I really think you're going to enjoy it. You're going to find that it's not just informative, but it's a very interesting read of a lot of information people haven't thought about before,
Yeah, I can confirm that. I'm working my way through the audiobook right now and really, really enjoying it and really like learning things that I didn't really think about. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, thank you.
So in your experience of working with, as you said, thousands upon thousands of people, helping millions of people through your books, what is the number one challenge that you see people face when it comes to lifestyle change? And what do you recommend to overcome this challenge?
I think the main challenge is they might learn about how to do this and want to apply it, but the negativity they get from their family or by their community or by the people they work with, the food addicts around them makes it harder to make the change. If you're trying to come off cigarettes and everybody around you is telling you, what are you doing that for? Just stay smoking cigarettes. It's better if you smoke. You're trying to come off alcohol, but everybody's trying to shove a drink in your face. So I think that we have societal sabotagers all around us. And so the biggest obstacle is not enlisting the family and your community and the difficulty of doing this in our social situation because there's so much, because eating unhealthfully and using food like drug and being addicted to unhealthy food is so much more popular and so much the social norm. So not only do people not have to give up what they like to eat and take the time to retrain their taste buds to learn new recipes and get that anxiety that change precipitates, but they also have to do it in an environment of negativity. It's bad enough, but they have everybody around them telling them what are they doing that for? It's difficult because the level it permeates society is not deep enough to make it easy for people.
Sometimes we have people who are really determined to make their lifestyle change possible, and they start eating a nutrient-dense plant-based diet, and then all along the way that they find that, their closest family members are the ones that are actually stopping the show because the food that they're making it's different than what they've been making over the past couple of years. And sometimes people even report that it's not, like within their culture, it can be culturally offensive to bring new dishes to a gathering. So what do you do in that situation if you're trying to rely on your family members and yet your family members are the ones that are putting up the most resistance?
Well, what I try to do is I try to bring the family members into the fold when a person is being informed about this. And I think that people learning about this, they're listening to this podcast, they're reading books, they're learning about this way of life. They have to bring their family members in early on as they're in the learning phases. So the family members are learning it with them and not wait till they change and then try to enlist a family member. In other words, the early they can get their family to at least understand. And, when you love another person, you care about them. The other person doesn't have to say, okay, I'm going to eat the same way you are. They have to say, if it's important to you, I want to understand what you're doing, and I want to support you in it. So I have to know about what you're doing and why, so I can properly support and encourage you in your efforts to get healthy. So I think that it's the way we speak to each other and the way we communicate and the way we give love to each other. I think it has to be in that framework of saying, look, that we're going to, that, like, because my kids all along through life, they used to say to me, don't these other parents love their children? Why do they let them eat that stuff that's going to damage their brain and cause cancer? Because they saw that the discussion about healthy food and the knowledge about healthy food was coming from love and concern for their life and their well-being. And if we didn't give them that, they would have felt deprived. You follow me? So it's the same way as that if we're giving this knowledge with love to other people, because it's hard, it's a hard art to give them, to want to feel like we want them to know it, but at the same time, we don't want to control them and force them into anything. So we have to introduce them in a way that they can make their own judgment and they can learn along with us. And they could choose to use their own free will to choose it or not. But the key here, the key factor, is have the person learn along with you and listen and read along with you and learn what you're learning so you can discuss things with people. So and building that clientele, building that community of like-minded people. I have website forums because I want people to communicate with people that are into the same, that are going to support them. And we encourage people to get to enlist their family. So if your family can't give you that support, then you have to look to outside the family, to friends, to internet groups, to other individuals who are doing this, who can give you that support. Because as human beings, having social relationships and having positive social relationships is a very important positive effect on our health.
I love it. This is a fantastic message. It's very similar to what Dr. Dean Ornish says also about, gathering community together and, making sure that you can support loved ones in the process, because that's a huge component of lifestyle change and you can't deny that. So thank you so much for your time today. We absolutely love you and we love the message that you're putting forth. Your books are phenomenal. And, your enthusiasm for the subject of adopting a nutrient-dense plant-based diet is it's contagious. It really is. So thank you for your time today. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us.
My pleasure. Wishing you and everybody listening, obviously, great health and much happiness always. Take care.